To the fast-thinking, high-altitude fighter pilots of the Second World War, the lumbering metal beast rocking on the ocean waves looked less like a weapon of war and more like a floating mechanical whale. It was painfully slow, completely unarmed for high-speed dogfighting, and so incredibly noisy inside that crews had to scream into their throat microphones just to be heard over the relentless metallic roar of the engines. Critics and military strategists mocked its bulbous hull, its awkward lines, and its seemingly delicate canopy, calling it a clumsy, defenseless relic of a bygone era of aviation. Even the crews who flew the Catalina knew its limits. They knew that if they were ever intercepted by a fast, agile German Messerschmitt or a Focke-Wulf, they had almost no chance of survival. Yet, in the vast, unforgiving deserts of the world's oceans, speed was not the ultimate currency of survival. Endurance was, and this ugly duckling was built to endure. The condemnation of the aircraft's clumsy form vanished in the freezing, storm-lashed spring of 1941. Nazi Germany's ultimate weapon, the legendary heavily armored battleship Bismarck, had just struck a mortal blow to the heart of the British Empire. On May 24th, in the ice-locked waters of Denmark Strait, a single devastating 38-centimeter armor-piercing shell from the Bismarck had penetrated the magazine of the HMS Hood, blowing the pride of the Royal Navy in half and leaving only 3 survivors out of a crew of over 1,400 men. Flush with victory, the Bismarck slipped into the vast gray expanses of the North Atlantic, heading for the safety of occupied France. The British Admiralty was desperate, throwing every available warship into a blind, frantic search across thousands of square miles of ocean. But in the heavy rain, thick fog, and massive swells, they completely lost contact. The German giant had vanished into the mist. If she reached the protective umbrella of the Luftwaffe in Brest, she would be practically untouchable, poised to strike at the Allied supply convoys that kept Great Britain alive. As the British Navy scrambled blindly, a single slow-moving PBY Catalina arose from the cold waters of Lough Erne, Northern Ireland, and headed directly into the heart of the North Atlantic gale. Flying a patrol mission in the Catalina was an exercise in physical and psychological torture. The cabin was completely unheated. The sub-zero Atlantic wind leaked through every structural rivet, and the relentless noise of the twin 1,200-horsepower Pratt & Whitney engines mounted directly above the pilot's head was deafening. For over 10 grueling hours, the crew of Catalina Z flew blind through heavy rain and violent turbulence, scanning a gray, shifting ocean that offered nothing but empty whitecaps and false alarms. Their eyes burned from exhaustion, their hands were numb from the cold, and the smell of raw aviation gasoline and engine oil filled the uninsulated metal cabin. They were searching for a needle in a haystack of water, operating on the absolute limit of human endurance. The secret to this ugly duckling's redemption lay in the brilliant, borderline indestructible engineering of Isaac M. Ladden. Ladden knew that to survive the brutal North Atlantic, the PBY had to keep its engines completely clear of destructive saltwater spray. He mounted the massive 104-foot wing on a central pylon high above the hull, a parasol wing. To eliminate the drag of the outrigger stabilizing floats needed for water takeoffs, he designed a revolutionary kinematic system that retracted the floats outward, folding them flat to form the actual wingtips of the aircraft. By turning the entire interior of this massive wing into a giant self-contained fuel tank holding 1,750 gallons of aviation gasoline, Ladden gave the Catalina an unbelievable maximum endurance of up to 30 hours in the air. It was a flying fuel tank, built to hunt across empty horizons where no other aircraft could survive. At exactly 10:30 a.m., May 26, 1941, the gamble paid off.
Breaking through a rare gap in the clouds at an altitude of just 500 feet, Ensign Tuck Smith, the American co-pilot flying clandestinely as a neutral observer before the United States had officially entered the war, spotted a long, dark shape cutting through the white foam of the ocean. He focused his binoculars through the rain, and his heart stopped. Rising out of the mist was a colossal, heavily armed titan of steel. It was the Bismarck. Within seconds, the German battleship's anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, filling the sky with explosive 20mm and 37mm flak that shredded the Catalina's thin metal skin. But the trap was already sprung. As the pilot executed sharp, violent maneuvers to escape the fire, the wireless operator frantically tapped out the coordinates to the Royal Navy. The ghost ship had been found. How did a slow, awkward patrol plane, widely mocked for its bulbous silhouette, become the ultimate savior of the British Empire and the key to destroying the greatest naval threat of World War II? Today, we unmask the brilliant, borderline indestructible engineering of the Consolidated PBY Catalina, the harrowing, freezing 30-hour patrols of the crews who flew it, and the high-stakes hunt across the Atlantic that turned an ugly duckling into the ultimate hunter of the sea. This is the story of the Catalina and the impossible hunt for the Bismarck.
To understand why the Catalina became the ultimate endurance machine of the Allied war effort, you have to look at the severe hydrodynamic challenges of building a massive, long-range flying boat. Designing an aircraft that must land on the open, unpredictably violent swells of the ocean is an aerodynamic nightmare. The primary enemy of a flying boat's engine is not cold or wind, it is salt water. During a high-speed water takeoff, the aircraft's bow throws back immense, crushing sheets of blinding sea spray. If that corrosive, high-velocity brine is sucked into the engine intakes, the cylinders will instantly seize, crippling the aircraft before it can ever leave the water. Isaac M. Ladden, the brilliant chief designer of Consolidated Aircraft, solved this puzzle with a radical, towering piece of aviation architecture. He mounted the aircraft's massive 104-foot wing on a central, heavy pylon situated directly above the hull, creating a dramatic, high-clearance parasol wing. This elevated the twin 1,200-horsepower Pratt & Whitney Twin Wasp radial engines far out of the path of destructive waves, ensuring that even in the roughest ocean states, the mechanical heart of the Catalina remained dry, functional, and feeding on pure, uncompromised air. But lifting the wing high into the air introduced a secondary, highly dangerous mechanical crisis: instability on the water. Without outrigger floats, a flying boat rocking on ocean swells will easily tilt to one side, dipping a wingtip into the water and capsizing the plane in seconds. Traditional flying boats utilized fixed, heavy stabilizing floats mounted beneath their wings, but these created massive, catastrophic parasitic drag once the aircraft was in the air, severely cutting its range and top speed. Ladden's team bypassed this limitation with a kinematic engineering masterpiece. They designed retractable wingtip floats. Once the Catalina broke free from the water's surface, the pilot engaged a series of heavy mechanical screw jacks. The stabilizing floats swung slowly outward and upward, pivoting on structural trusses until they folded perfectly flat, forming the actual outer wingtips of the airplane. This elegant folding architecture instantly streamlined the wing, dropping the aircraft's drag coefficient by an astonishing margin and transforming a clumsy, waterlogged barge into a highly efficient, aerodynamically clean, long-range glider. This streamlined wing was hiding the true secret of the Catalina's legendary endurance. Ladden did not waste space with heavy, independent internal fuel cells that added dead weight. Instead, he engineered the entire interior cavity of the massive single-spar wing to act as a self-contained structural wet-wing fuel tank. This immense internal volume held an astonishing 1,750 gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline.
It was an unprecedented fuel load for a twin-engine aircraft, turning the wing itself into a massive flying reservoir. At a conservative patrol throttle setting, the Twin Wasp engines consumed fuel so slowly that the Catalina possessed a maximum continuous flight endurance of over 30 hours without ever needing to touch the ground. A single, sleepless crew could search up to 100,000 square miles of empty ocean on a single flight, an unthinkable operational range that allowed them to patrol where no other aircraft on Earth could survive. But this unparalleled endurance came at a crushing physical cost to the crew. The Catalina was never designed for comfort. It was a cold, unheated, and uninsulated metal shell. To survive a 30-hour patrol, the 9-man crew had to endure a hellish environment. The interior of the hull was a vibrating echo chamber where the noise of the propeller tips spinning just inches from the cabin walls was loud enough to cause permanent hearing damage. Because the aircraft had to fly low to search the water surface, it was constantly subjected to brutal low-altitude maritime turbulence, tossing the crew like ragdolls inside the dark metal hull. There was a small primitive galley and 2 cramped bunks in the rear, but sleeping was nearly impossible as the smell of raw gasoline, hot engine oil, and grease saturated the air. The physical toll on the pilots was immense. The heavy control surfaces had no hydraulic boost, requiring raw muscular force to keep the heavy plane level for hours on end. The Catalina was an absolute ordeal of human endurance, a slow, grueling test of wills between the freezing, sleepless crews and the infinite empty horizons they were tasked with hunting.
To the British Empire in the spring of 1941, the HMS Hood was not simply a warship, she was the floating, steel embodiment of British global naval hegemony. For over 20 years, this majestic battlecruiser had sailed the oceans as an untouchable symbol of Royal Navy invincibility. But in the freezing early morning mist of May 24, that illusion was shattered in less than 6 minutes. A single catastrophic 38-centimeter armor-piercing shell fired from the German battleship Bismarck traveled at hypersonic speeds, plunged through the Hood's vulnerable deck armor, and detonated directly inside her aft ammunition magazines. The resulting explosion was apocalyptic, blowing the massive 42,000-ton vessel completely in half. Out of a crew of 1,418 highly trained men, only 3, Ted Briggs, Robert Tilburn, and William Dundas, survived to tell the tale, pulled shivering from the oil-slicked icy water. The Bismarck had committed a mortal sin against the British crown, and the entire Royal Navy erupted in a fury of grief and desperate vengeance. Yet, as Admiral John Tovey mobilized every available battleship, cruiser, and destroyer in the home fleet to hunt down the German Titan, the Atlantic itself turned hostile. A massive low-pressure system rolled across the ocean, bringing with it driving sleet, towering 20-foot swells, and a dense, impenetrable blanket of gray sea fog. The Bismarck, though slightly damaged and trailing a steady plume of fuel tanks after a brief exchange with the HMS Prince of Wales, had utilized the blinding weather to slip past her pursuers. She was running for the safety of occupied France, specifically the heavily defended ports of Brest or Saint-Nazaire. The Admiralty was gripped by a cold, rising panic. If the Bismarck reached the deep-water bays of France, she would be placed under the impenetrable protective umbrella of the Luftwaffe's anti-aircraft divisions and submarine bases, forever altering the balance of power in the Battle of the Atlantic. And in the blind, chaotic gale, the Royal Navy had completely lost her. The ghost ship was heading home, and the Allies were flying blind. The desperate final hope of the British Empire now rested on the shivering shoulders of a few specialized maritime patrol squadrons operating on the absolute margins of geography. Flying out of RAF Castle Archdale on Lough Erne, Northern Ireland, the crews of No. 209 and No. 240 squadrons were ordered to fly continuous, high-stakes searches into the teeth of the Atlantic storm.
Geopolitically, these flights were fraught with immense tension. Because the Irish Free State was strictly neutral, British patrol planes were theoretically forbidden from crossing Irish airspace. To save critical flight time and fuel, the Irish government secretly permitted a narrow, clandestine flight path over County Donegal in Ireland, a geographic lifeline known to the aircrews as the Donegal Corridor. It was through this narrow sliver of sky that the sluggish Catalinas pushed, flying directly into the blinding storms of the open ocean. To fly these maritime search sweeps was to enter a world of pure physical and sensory torment. For the 9-man crew of Catalina Z, the flight was an endless, shivering marathon of exhaustion. The PBY's cabin was completely unheated, and as they climbed into the dark, moisture-heavy cloud bases, the temperature inside the fuselage plummeted to sub-zero levels. The crew wore layers of heavy wool, thick sheepskin flight jackets, and leather boots, but the damp Atlantic cold penetrated to their bones. There was no autopilot system to relieve the pilots. The heavy, unassisted manual controls required constant, physically exhausting muscular strain to keep the giant flying boat from being rolled over by the violent, low-altitude thermal updrafts of the ocean storm. The uninsulated metal hull acted as a massive sounding board, amplifying the deafening roar of the twin 1,230-horsepower Pratt & Whitney engines mounted just 4 feet above the cockpit roof. The relentless vibration rattled their teeth, shook their instruments, and filled the cabin with the toxic, nauseating fumes of scorched engine oil and high-octane gasoline. But the physical torment of the flight was nothing compared to the psychological weight carried by the crew. Clandestinely seated in the co-pilot's chair of Catalina Z was Ensign Leonard B. Tuck Smith, a highly trained United States Navy pilot. Smith's presence on this flight was a keeply guarded, highly illegal military secret. The United States was still 7 months away from officially entering the war, and under the strict terms of the Neutrality Acts, American military personnel were forbidden from engaging in active combat. Smith had been sent to Great Britain under the cover of Technical Observer to train RAF crews on the newly delivered Catalinas, but in the desperation of the Bismarck crisis, he had quietly slipped into the cockpit as an active co-pilot. If his plane was shot down or captured by the Germans, it would spark an international diplomatic catastrophe. Smith knew the stakes, and as the clock ticked past the 10th hour of their patrol, his eyes scanned the white-capped ocean with absolute, unwavering focus. At exactly 10:30 a.m. on May 26, 1941, the relentless, bone-chilling search yielded its prize. Pushing the heavy Catalina through a rare low gap in the cloud base at just 500 feet above the cresting waves, Tuck Smith spotted a long, dark shape carving a massive white wake through the gray ocean water. He grabbed his binoculars, focused through the driving rain, and felt his heart stop. There, rising out of the North Atlantic mist like an iron castle, was the unmistakable, terrifying profile of the battleship Bismarck. The ghost ship had been found. Within seconds, the German lookout team spotted the slow-moving flying boat. The Bismarck's legendary anti-aircraft gunners opened fire, unleashing a terrifying wall of explosive 20mm and 37mm flak that tore through the clouds, shredding the Catalina's thin metal skin and shaking the unarmored airframe with violent concussive blasts. But as Briggs slammed the heavy throttles forward to dive back into the safety of the cloud cover, the wireless operator was already frantically tapping out the historic coordinate transmission to the British fleet. The hunt was over, and the vengeance of the Royal Navy was about to be unleashed.
The moment the Catalina broke cover, the Bismarck's crew reacted with lethal, synchronized precision. At a distance of barely half a mile, the battleship's massive anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. The sky around the sluggish flying boat was instantly laced with a spiderweb of high-velocity tracer rounds and explosive shrapnel. Operating at a maximum evasion speed of barely 110 knots, the PBY was an incredibly large, slow-moving target. Briggs fought the unboosted heavy controls, diving the aircraft down to a mere 100 feet above the towering waves to escape the deadly envelope of the German guns. Metal shrapnel tore through the fabric-covered sections of the ailerons, and several rounds punctured the rear hull near the waist blisters. But the PBY's structural continuous spar held firm, absorbing the impact without buckling. While the pilots fought the controls, the wireless operator, focused entirely on his key, frantically tapped out the historic contact report to the British home fleet. One battleship, bearing 150 degrees, distance 30 miles, steering 130 degrees. Because of the intense German fire, the message was broken, but it was enough. The coordinate transmission was intercepted by the Admiralty, establishing a lock on the Bismarck's position that the Germans could never shake. For the next 10 hours, Catalina Z, soon joined by a relief Catalina from No. 240 Squadron, shadowed the German giant. Orbiting at the absolute limit of visibility, weaving in and out of the low cloud base, the freezing, exhausted aircrew kept visual contact, reporting every course change the Bismarck attempted. They were the silent, invisible shadow that the German High Command had never anticipated. Guided by the Catalina's precise coordinates, the Royal Navy prepared its final, desperate strike. The aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal, pitching so violently in the storm that her flight deck rose and fell by over 50 feet, launched 15 Fairey Swordfish biplanes into the gathering gloom. To any modern strategist, these open-cockpit, fabric-covered biplanes, derisively nicknamed string bags, looked as obsolete as the Catalina. They flew at a top speed of barely 90 knots, their crews exposed to the freezing rain and sub-zero wind. But their very obsolescence became their greatest tactical advantage. Because they were made of wood and fabric, the Bismarck's advanced radar-guided fire controllers could not calculate their speed, and their shells simply passed through the fabric wings without detonating. Diving through a wall of 10.5 centimeter and 15 centimeter secondary battery fire, the biplanes pressed their attacks at point-blank range, dropping their payloads directly into the churning swells. At exactly 9:05 p.m., a single devastating 18-inch Mark 12 torpedo struck the very stern of the Bismarck. The underwater detonation was cataclysmic. It did not merely damage the ship, it punched a massive hole in her steering compartment, flooding the room with thousands of tons of rushing seawater and jamming her massive dual-balanced steel rudders at a sharp 12-degree port turn. The German Leviathan, built to dominate the oceans, was suddenly locked into an inescapable slow circular path, steering directly toward her approaching executioners. On the morning of May 27th, the battleships HMS King George V and HMS Rodney closed the trap. They unleashed an apocalyptic, relentless bombardment of 35.6 centimeter and 40.6 centimeter high explosive and armor-piercing shells. Locked in her helpless circle, the unsteerable Bismarck could only fire back in desperate, uncoordinated salvos as the British battleships systematically dismantled her superstructure, silencing her guns one by one. By 10:39 a.m., engulfed in flame and with her senior command dead, the pride of the Kriegsmarine rolled over and slipped forever beneath the cold 2-mile-deep waters of the Atlantic. The ugly Duckling flying boat, widely mocked as a slow, bloated relic of the past, had single-handedly delivered the killing blow to the greatest threat to Allied survival. It was not a high-speed interceptor or a heavily armed cruiser that won the Battle of the Atlantic. It was a slow, unstreamlined patrol plane, built for pure, uncompromised endurance, guided by a freezing, sleepless crew who refused to look away.
Ladin's brilliant organic design had turned the tide of the war, proving that in the vast, unforgiving deserts of the global oceans, the ultimate weapon is not the one that flies the fastest, but the one that refuses to come down. If you want to know how another slow, fixed-wing Allied underdog dismissed as a pre-war relic single-handedly destroyed 4 of Japan's elite aircraft carriers at the Battle of Midway, click on the video on your screen right now. Let us know in the comments, would you have had the endurance to fly a 30-hour patrol in a freezing Catalina? Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next deep dive.